Yes, no, yeah, now we are recording. I do have even transcription, I don't know if it's necessary. Um, well, very well. We are here today for our second session of our fifth edition of our online seminar, Connecta and Mitjana. And today we have the pleasure to receive William Curtis, PhD candidate of University of Manchester and member of the team of research and advised by Professor Paul Oldfield, sorry. And I'm very happy with his acceptance for my invitations, especially in the circumstances. It was very like short notice. And besides that, the research that he's developing now, it's just perfect for what you are offering this in this edition, and with that, I consider really a huge lack of our side to have him with us. Um, William de Curtis has a very interesting topic today. His paper has the title "Sans Cults and Lombard Ethnic Identity in Late 11th Century Salerno," and he approached some very specific situation of interaction between, let's say, two cultures, if you can put it generically in this way. And we hope, following the idea of this edition, we can have some interesting conclusions today, or at least start to make some conclusions, and to follow up for our next sections, and especially in our final session, which is a round table with all our invitees of this first block. And well, unfortunately, I don't have today Professor Igor Salazar. I invited him for also share this session, but unfortunately he could attend. But he told me that starting with the next, he'll be in our sessions anyway. It's important also that all these sessions are going to be recorded and we're going to put in our channel, and with that you can at least have some continuity, I hope. With that you can kind of come back, rewatch it. It is very important, especially if you take in consideration the discussion you're going to have at the end, and hopefully maybe some publication or some project in this way. Well, though, without more delays, I would like to pass the floor, metaphorically, the floor to our colleague. And please, William, you have the word.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining me, and also for inviting me to speak here alongside all of the other exciting research that's going on. I'm looking forward to especially talking about it at the round table in January. That'll be very exciting. I'll just try and share my screen and then we can start. I'm more of a Zoom person, so let's see if this works. Can you see the PowerPoint on the screen now?
Yes.
Great. So my name is William Curtis. I'm a third-year doctoral student at the University of Manchester, working on the continuation of Lombard ethnic identity in the Campania region of southern Italy following the Norman infiltration, with a specific focus on the late 11th and early 12th centuries. As you can see on the screen, my paper today will focus on one small aspect of this research, the relationship between ethnicity and saints' cults in Salerno in the period immediately following Robert Guiscard's conquest of the city, for want of a better word. Specific attention will be given to the reinvigoration of the cult of St Matthew. This has traditionally been viewed as a successful example of the Norman rulers hijacking local religious culture to situate themselves within the region's landscape of sanctity and legitimise their political power. However, by examining the development of this cult through the lens of ethnicity, and reconsidering the role of Archbishop Alfanus I, alongside the repopularisation of another local cult, I hope that we can start to see two different sides to this story. Yes, the reinvigoration was a successful attempt by the Normans to legitimise their political role, but it also provided the Lombard population an outlet to connect to their collective history and perform their ethnic identity in the face of socio-political change. With the development of this cult, we also see a new leader imbued with the agency to represent the Lombard population in the form of their archbishop. Underscoring all of this is the theme of pragmatism. The Norman legitimation project was unable to be particularly intrusive or invasive, and therefore the cult of St Matthew was not Normanised to a great extent. Similarly, the Lombard population had to find subtle methods to perform their ethnicity within the activity of the cult, to prevent alienating their new overlords responsible for elevating the political and economic status of the city. Before this, I'll briefly go through my methodological and theoretical approach to historical ethnicity and provide some contextual information which might be helpful for those coming to the presentation with different interests and sort of research backgrounds. So at its most basic, I conceive ethnic identities as social groups constructed to serve the needs and to help shape the future of those who hold power within a society. This construction then undergoes a discursive process with other groups as expectations and perceived characteristics are continually renegotiated. This situational and flexible conception of ethnicity means that almost any social action can be regarded as ethnic performance, provided that it is imbued with this significance by the ethnic group in question. This allows evidence such as hagiographic texts and liturgical performances to be viewed as part of contemporary ethnic discourse, and this idea draws a lot from Pierre Bourdieu's theory of magical action, if you're familiar with that. I also believe that such ethnic performances and signifiers are arbitrary to the actual idea of the ethnicity itself, meaning they can change without the imagined character of the ethnic group also changing. It is unfortunate that there is no full-length study on ethnicity within Lombard southern Italy. Scholars such as Amalia Galdi and Joanna Drell have kind of took a little bit further in this and have highlighted cultural factors such as adherence to Lombard law, kinship networks, and religious culture as being integral to Lombard self-perception. To put it as clearly as possible for the purpose of this paper, to be a Lombard in the late 11th century meant playing an active role in local Campanian culture. For example, men were expected to act as mundwald or legal guardian for wives, mothers, and daughters, and the Beneventan religious rite involved celebrating saints translated to the region by historical Lombard figures. This last point is particularly crucial for us today, since, as will be seen, Lombard ethnic performance was often contingent on continually evoking memory of the Lombard past for significance in the present, providing a link between the past, present, and future of the local population. Bearing this in mind, let's now move on to a very, very brief recap of the historical context to this research. So this map shows the Campania region around the year 1000 and the de facto independent Lombard polities of Capua, Benevento, and Salerno are clearly visible. Over the next 130 years, almost the entirety of the land on this map was subordinated by Norman infiltrators. Only the city of Benevento actually survived the Norman takeover, and it instead submitted to papal subordination in 1073 and then became a vassal of the popes. However, the rest of the Duchy of Benevento was lost to the Normans. The Principality of Salerno fell to the Normans with the surrender of the city in December 1076, following a siege. Salerno then became the capital of the Norman Duchy of Apulia, led by Robert Guiscard and his successors. Guiscard was a particularly active Norman expansionist, and his actions led to Salerno quickly becoming the economic and political centre of the Norman mainland, providing the city with a level of sort of socio-political significance that it hadn't seen for centuries. I should also emphasise that the ideas discussed in this presentation need to be set against the background of the 11th and 12th century Gregorian reform, which had widespread impact on the ecclesiastic structure and the spiritual trends of southern Italy. It's also worth noting that the sanctity of the region has had quite a lot of scholarship written on it, particularly looking at the kind of resurgence of cultic activity in the late 11th century, However, the general consensus is that the religious life of the region was relatively untouched by the Normans. It would make sense for us then to look for ethnic performance in such an area of perceived cultural continuation. In the centuries prior to the arrival of the Normans in southern Italy, Sanctity in Salerno was heavily intertwined with cultic activity at Benevento, the spiritual capital of the Mezzogiorno's Lombards. The actions of Archbishop II and the subsequent popularity of Benevento's saints created what was essentially a pan-Lombard religious culture, and the same saints were venerated throughout the region. At the centre of all of this was the Lombard capital of southern Italy, Benevento. This relationship persisted into the late 11th century, with Salerno being explicitly incorporated into the tradition surrounding the translation of Bartholomew, the Apostle Bartholomew, to Benevento in Martin of Santa Sofia's Translatio. Sermons were also written for the 12 Holy Brothers of Benevento, which was one of the primary cults popularised at Santa Sofia by one of Salerno's most influential archbishops. Even within the Translatio of St Matthew to Salerno, which was written around the year 1000, the hagiographer directly incorporates Benevento within the remit of the saint's patronage, relating a miracle in which a man is miraculously freed from prison upon the arrival of one of Matthew's arms in Benevento, thus making a concerted effort to bind the sanctity of the two cities within the hagiography of Salerno's most high-profile saint. Between the division of Lombard territories in 849 and the Norman infiltration of Campania, the city of Salerno did make some attempt to encourage cultic activity which was independent of Benevento. The translation of St Matthew the Apostle in 954 is by far the most apparent sort of manifestation of this, and it has been viewed as an attempt by Gisulf I and the Archbishop Bernardo to provide the city with the ingredients necessary to produce a civic identity, which was worthy of a new Lombard capital that was now separate from Benevento. The cults of Salerno, however, without a major scriptorium like Santa Sofia, and as a result of the disruption caused by the Muslim raiding of the 9th and 10th centuries, were unable to gain sufficient traction within the city to rival the saints of Benevento. And as the scholar Amalia Galdi argues, the sacred character of the city was not fully realised. By the time of the city's surrender to Robert Guiscard in December 1076, and Salerno's subsequent absorption into the Norman Duchy of Apulia, these ingredients of a salient civic identity remained. Given that 2 centuries had passed since the initial separation of Salerno from Benevento and Capua, and the city's new status as Guiscard's de facto capital, the Normans must have sensed the possibility to manipulate the social dynamics of the city to forge a civic identity which was centred around Salerno's present rather than its past. This would simultaneously legitimise the power of the Norman overlords, while also superseding any form of ethnic identity which bound Salerno's Lombards with the rest of Campania. The primary vector chosen for this purpose was the semi-dormant cult of St Matthew, which was identified as having the potential to assume a central role in Salerno's new identity. By the time the Normans took power at Salerno, the cult was in a semi-dormant state with little overt evidence of devotion in about 7 decades, so since around the year 1000. In the years following Matthew's translation, the saint does appear to have initially resonated with the local population. As mentioned, there was a translatio which included a miracula of all of the miracles that Matthew conducted at Salerno, which was written around the year 1000, and this also kind of does express undertones of Salerno's civic identity, but also a much broader sense of Lombard collective identity. There is also evidence of several churches existing which were dedicated to Matthew immediately following the translation, of taxes being collected on the saint's feast day in the year 971, and of a cathedral confraternity in existence which was dedicated to the saint, again around the year 1000. But something appears to have happened in this, and it doesn't seem to be in existence by the 1070s. However, perhaps due to the political instability of the 11th century, such examples of cultic activity are absent after the turn of the millennium, and there is no evidence of the cult expanding outside of the immediate urban area of Salerno. Upon the surrender of Salerno to Robert Guiscard, the subsequent reinvigoration of the cult is perhaps the most successful example of Normans in southern Italy hijacking local culture to naturalise their presence in the region, with Paul Oldfield describing it as a set-piece statement of the Norman strategy of rule. The most conspicuous evidence of this Norman intervention is the construction of the Norman cathedral intended to house the relics of the apostle. The cathedral, designed by Salerno's Archbishop Alfanus I, who we'll talk about a lot recently in the next few minutes, became a physical embodiment of the new Norman dynasty's power and a tangible public representation of the relationship between the new secular rulership and Salerno's archbishops. Within the construction of the cathedral, both Guiscard's dynasty and Salerno's archbishops were physically connected to Matthew's cult, a link publicly communicated by the dedicatory inscription on the platband which sits above the main entrance to the cathedral, and which also credited both Alfanus and Guiscard as the patrons of the project. This placed the cult at the centre of a web of relations between the urban population, secular rulership, and ecclesiastical authority, and future veneration of the cult meant indirectly accepting the validity of the Norman rulers and their alliance with the city's prelates. Such a connection was kept alive by Guiscard's successors, both Roger Borsa and then Guiscard's grandson, William II, Duke of Apulia, minted coins with the profile of Matthew, which you can see on the screen, further intertwining the legitimacy of their dynasty with Matthew, who became symbolic of Salerno's identity. Alongside the construction of the cathedral, a robust propaganda programme was also underway, which further intertwined Norman authority with the reinvigorated cult of the apostle. Guiscard became a devoted supplicant of St Matthew, taking one of the saint's arms with him on his Byzantine campaigns, further merging his political power and military prowess with the cult at Salerno. The connection between St Matthew and the Normans was also historicised by the Cassinese monk Martyrs in his chronicle, The History of the Normans. This juxtaposes the virtuous Guiscard with the final Lombard prince of Salerno, Gisulf II, whom it depicts as like a tyrannous, wicked prince. Martyrs also gives a nocturnal vision of St Matthew to Archbishop John of Salerno, who was alive, well, the 1050s, so about 20 years before the actual conquest. And this prophesies the Norman infiltration and lays the blame squarely on the Lombard princes, which you can see on the top quote on the screen. Throughout the text, Guiscard is portrayed as more worthy of the saint's favour than the Lombard prince. While Gisulf tortures, imprisons and loots the ships of Pisan sailors who worshipped at the shrine, and then also sacks Matthew's tomb in a rageful frenzy during the siege of Salerno, Guiscard is shown as a pious, well-tempered man, worthy of saintly patronage, legitimising his actions as the conqueror of the city. Within his text, Martyrs further validates the circumstances surrounding the reinvigoration of Matthew's cult by separating the tyranny of Gisulf from the character of Alfanus I, who allegedly became Guiscard's ally and the primary Lombard proponent of the cult. And in this text, he's depicted as an exemplary prelate who's equally as worthy of Matthew's patronage as his Norman associate. Taken together, the Norman adoption of St Matthew as a symbol of their rulership, the construction of the new cathedral dedicated to the apostle, and the propaganda campaign which further intertwined the new secular powers within the saint, created a kind of double-bind situation for the Salerno Lombards. Resisting the change from Lombard to Norman rulership meant jeopardising the saintly prestige endowed upon Salerno by the reinvigorated cult of St Matthew, as well as the politico-economic benefits created by the city's status as the new Norman capital. Any form of resistance would have proved difficult without a valid Lombard leader, since the Archbishop had allied himself to the Normans, and Gisulf II was exiled to Capua, and at this point was quite a weak old man and died within the next 3 years. The alternative was to embrace the city's new circumstances, actively acknowledging St Matthew as Salerno's patron saint, while simultaneously legitimating the power of the Normans and accepting the connection between the Norman overlords, the Archbishop, and Matthew. Salerno seemingly opted for the latter, and the popularity of Matthew within the city grew exponentially throughout the Norman period. By the late 12th century, the cult had a visible onomastic impact in Salernitan sources, and by the 13th century there was a biannual fair which took place in the city during the weeks of Matthew's solemnity and Matthew's translation, which involved a pilgrimage of artisans and merchants, both locals and visitors, to the shrine of the saint, attesting to the growth of the cult. Popular devotion to Matthew's cult and the Norman dynasty's adoption of the saint as a symbol of their power has generally led historians to conclude that Salerno quickly developed an identity which was intrinsically civic, based upon communal devotion to the city's patron saint, as well as the political circumstances of the late 11th and early 12th centuries. However, with a slight shift in our approach to the evidence surrounding the cult of St. Matthew, I would argue that the cult emerges as a theatre for the negotiation of ethnicity within the city. Within the cult, continuity with the past and acknowledgement of the changing present collide, offering the Lombard population a third option, if you will, which allowed them to continue to perform their ethnicity while also taking part in the more independent identity emerging in Norman Salerno. At the heart of this negotiation was Alfanus I, the archbishop who found himself at the centre of the rejuvenation of the cult, responsible for mediating between the Norman overlords and his Lombard flock. While Guiscard's motives for reinvigorating the cult of St. Matthew were certainly political, those of his associate in the project, Alfanus, haven't received much attention. Evidence suggests the archbishop was actually the primary protagonist in the cultic revival. He was the architect of the new cathedral. His name appears more than Guiscard's on the dedicatory inscriptions within the cathedral, and this name is also often placed before that of the Norman. It is also he who receives a letter from Pope Gregory VII, congratulating him for the rediscovering the relics of St. Matthew, and Guiscard's name is completely absent from this letter. Indeed, it does look like Alfanus was responsible for the direction of the cult beyond the legitimising function performed for Robert Guiscard. And a deeper understanding of the Archbishop's past allows us to reconsider the motivations behind these actions. Thankfully, due to various historical sources, we are able to trace Alfanus' life quite comprehensively. He was born into an elite Lombard family with ties to the Salerno and princely court, and was given a typically Lombard name. It seems he was then provisioned with quite an extensive education, likely at Salerno and then potentially at Aversa, where he would have experienced the initial phase of Norman settlement in southern Italy. Alfanus then became a member of the monastic community at the Beneventan Abbey of Santa Sofia, probably for about 4 years between 1054 and 1058, during which he would have gained extensive knowledge of the cults which were later repackaged in the city in the 1070s, such as that of St. Mercurius, the 12 Holy Brothers, and of St. Bartholomew. Following this, he spent some time at Monte Cassino, where he formed some close personal relationships with several figures of the Gregorian reform, including Hildebrand of Savannah, who later became Gregory VII, Peter Damian, and the Cassinese abbot Desiderius, the later Victor III, who influenced the Salernitan with their kind of reformist ideals. In 1057, Alfanus was then appointed abbot of San Benedetto in Salerno, the city's largest urban abbey, if you will, and by 1058 he had been elected archbishop of the city. As such, he had almost 2 decades of experience at the highest ecclesiastical level at Salerno before the city's surrender, during which he would have witnessed the final decades of Lombard rule and the gradual increase of Norman power. Alfanus' actions during this period appear to contradict his eventual alliance with Guiscard, suggesting initial resistance to the Norman infiltration and an ingrained responsibility to protect the Lombard population, leading to questions regarding his motives during the reinvigoration of Matthew's cult. In the 1070s, there is evidence that Alfanus fought to retain his archdiocese's right over the shrine to St. Michael at Mount Gargano in Apulia. Both Pope Alexander II and Robert Guiscard were forced to confirm his supremacy over this cult of the Lombards' national patron saint, if you will, ensuring the territory remained under Alfanus' supervision and no one else's. In 1059, Alfanus' signature also appears on a decree from the Papal Synod at Benevento, aimed at protecting the territory of the Abbey of San Vincenzo al Volturno against a predatory Norman, confirming the abbey's ownership of the land forever, and imposing a penalty of eternal anathema on anyone who violated the ruling in the future, thus setting a precedent for the protection of the institution's properties in the face of Norman aggression. Even more significant are the dealings between Alfanus and the Salernitan Prince Guizulf II, relations which Martyrs of Monte Cassino, in his chronicle, quite tellingly completely ignored as part of his invective against the prince. In a document which has perhaps not received sufficient scholarly attention, the Charta Permutationis, we are told that in 1062, Alfanus and the Lombard prince participated in an extensive exchange of property. In exchange for a single Salernitan monastery, the monastery of San Vito, which was very small and not particularly significant, Alfanus gave to the prince 3 fortresses in the mountains surrounding Salerno, which belonged to the prelate because of the chapels which were attached to them. These fortifications were the primary fortress of the city, which is still visible on the land above Salerno and is now called the Castello di Orecchi, a fortress in the valley of Cava di Tereni, and another on the slopes of Monte San Liberatore to the immediate west of the city. Each of these sites are circled on the screen, superimposed on a map of the present-day city. So the actual medieval city would have been much smaller than this. The uneven nature of the transaction was highlighted in this charter, and it is stressed that since the fortresses were of no use to the archbishop, then the agreement did not infringe upon Lombard law, which prevented such unequal sort of exchanges of land. The agreement allowed the Lombard prince to complete a string of defensive fortifications, which ran across the ridges from the northwest of the city, around through the valley and around the slopes of Mont San Liberatore, and then across to the northeastern edge of the city. This defensive perimeter was intended to furnish the city against assaults from the west all the way across to the northeast, protecting the Lombard city from Norman invaders and forcing any besieging army to attack from the southeast, simplifying defensive military procedure for the Lombards of Salerno. Within this transaction, we can see an archbishop working alongside his prince to protect his city from Norman aggression, and therefore fought an overt attempt to protect the Lombard dynasty of the city. Alfanus was also a prolific author, producing a total of 68 poems and hymns across his life. The content of these literary works also permits this alternative reading of his actions around the cult of St Matthew. Together, the hymns show an author deeply intertwined within his social world, expressing undertones of Salernitan civic identity, but also a keen understanding of the Lombard history and shared ethnic identity which united Benevento, Capua, and Salerno. At some point, likely during his time at Santa Sofia, Alfanus produced 2 hymns for the 12 Holy Brothers, a cult centred at the Beneventan Abbey. These martyr saints had been translated to Benevento by the legendary Lombard prince Archbishop II, and their cult became one of the central aspects of the pan-Lombard religious culture which spread across the Campania region. At Benevento, the only Lombard city to avoid direct Norman rule, the cult was purposely reinvigorated in the late 11th century, along with a few others, to provide a religious pole through which the Lombard community could perform their ethnicity and their independence. This, however, is a story for another day. Turning back to Alfanus, unsurprisingly, many of the hymns were written for liturgical use on the feast days of St Matthew, and several of these became ingrained within local liturgy, with some persisting until at least the 15th century. What is striking about the Archbishop's hymns for St Matthew is their lack of reference to contemporary events, like the late 11th century rediscovery of the saint's relics, and the construction of the new cathedral to house the shrine for Matthew, which is mentioned in passing only once out of all of these 68 poems. Robert Guiscard, essentially the lay patron of the rejuvenated cult, is also conspicuously absent from many of the 13 hymns dedicated to Matthew. Much like the cathedral, he appears only once, alongside a reference to Jordan, Prince of Capua, suggesting an aversion on behalf of the Archbishop to historicise the Norman aspect of the cult within the local liturgy, and perhaps allowing a glimpse at his true political sympathies. Instead, the hymns focus on the biblical deeds of the saint, and, more significantly, the Lombard history of Matthew's translation. Within these hymns, Alfanus often adopts the plural, extolling the clergy to associate the Lombard past and civic identity with their collective present, and connecting their relationship with the saint to the Lombard translation, rather than the 11th century rejuvenation. 2 examples of this type of language from within the hymns can be seen on the screen. Alfanus' attitude towards ethnic identity and a window into his political sympathies are also visible in the content of his hymns regarding the secular sphere. Again, the lack of hymns focused upon the Norman present is striking. Robert Guiscard, that his ally and the man responsible for Salerno's political advancement, receives no dedicatory hymn, and indeed, as I've just said, only appears once in all 68 poems. It is particularly illuminating that no hymn was composed for Guiscard's son, Roger Borsa, which would have further legitimated the dynasty of Alfanus' new political allies. Interestingly, however, Alfanus did write 2 poems for Lombard elites of Salerno, one for Prince Gisulf II and another for his brother Guy. In his hymn dedicated to Gisulf, Alfanus is very laudatory of the prince, painting him as a glorious warrior, more valiant than the classical conquest of Carthage, further evidence of the once close relationship between archbishop and prince, which we've had a glimpse at in their land transactions. Even more illuminating is the hymn for Guy, which initially focuses on the reign of his father, Prince Guaimar IV, who died in 1052. Within this section of the poem, the time of Guaimar is presented as a golden age for Salerno, when the city was the principal and richest city of Latium, and it is explicitly stated that the downfall of this era was the result of numerous defeats by the Gallic people, a clear reference to the Normans. These quotes can be viewed on the screen. In the poem, Alfanus then goes on to extol the virtues of Guy and to advocate the Lombard dynasty's campaigns against the Byzantines. Both Nicola Acquacella and Arturo Corrucci have commented on the significance of these poems. Acquacella argues they represent Alfanus' wish to eternalise the recent Lombard past of Salerno, on account of the Archbishop's quote-unquote nostalgia. Corrucci, however, suggests that alongside attempting to make amends for the actions of his Lombard brothers, Alfanus was also instilling the figure of Guy with the ideals of the Lombard youth, that is, to unite the Mezzogiorno for the Lombards by expelling the Byzantines and Islamic settlers during a time when there was hope of a return to Salerno's Lombard heyday. That this was written in the period of Norman rule is quite telling, and you can definitely kind of read between the lines of that. Taking together, Alfanus' life before the Norman siege and the content of his literary works allow us to gain a deeper understanding of the individual. The evidence, typified by his memorialization of Salerno's Lombard past in the poems for Gisulf and Guy, suggests a man deeply connected to his Lombard ethnic identity and with an understanding of the importance of that identity in a time when the Mezzogiorno was undergoing intense political and social change. We are therefore required to reconsider his lines with Robert Guiscard, as it is difficult to imagine the Lombard noble who intentionally reinforced Gisulf's fortification of the city, then willingly allying himself with the Norman conqueror of the same city. Instead, it makes more sense to view the alliance as entirely pragmatic, and as Archbishop, it would have likely been viewed by Alfanus as the best option for his citizens. He would remain in place to smoothen the political transition and maintain some semblance of continuity for his citizens. The reinvigoration of the cult of St Matthew should then be seen as fulfilling the needs of both its lay and ecclesiastical patron. It was used by Alfanus to redefine power structures within Salerno and place himself as the de facto leader of the Lombards of both his city and his archdiocese, which soon became the largest in southern Italy. Alfanus' interaction with the cult then meant that the power of the archbishops of Salerno was not based upon the Norman overlords of the city, but rather on the relationship between themselves, their community, and their patron saint. In the following decades, this relationship between the saint and the prelates was formalized with the development of an annual public procession on the feast for the translation of St Matthew. At the heart of this procession was the archbishop himself, rather than the saint. The archbishop followed a procession of local abbots and suffragan bishops through the streets of the city before taking centre stage in the cathedral. Here, representatives of the 15 city parishes made an offering to the archbishop, and liturgical celebrations for the feasts of Matthew's translation commenced. Throughout this event, the memory of Matthew's translation was used to evoke and perform the Lombard past in the present, with the only reminder of the Norman patronage of the cult being the cathedral itself. This performance of collective memory allowed the archbishops, who throughout the Norman period all but one originated from the Lombard stock of southern Italy, to act as the head of their Lombard community. This provided continuity between the princely past and the Norman present, and facilitated ethnic performance in a manner which would not have roused opposition from the new lay patrons of the cult. Alongside re-articulating the role of the Archbishop, it appears Alfanus also ensured the cult of Matthew remained palatable to the Lombard population, and provided subtle means by which the ethnic identity of his flock could be actively performed through participation with the cult and the new cathedral. Although not particularly active in the decades immediately prior to the Norman siege, the cult would always have been understood as something intrinsically Lombard by the citizens of Salerno. The translation was carried out by a Lombard prince during a time of political union between Salerno, Capua and Benevento. An arm of St Matthew had been given as a gift to the Cathedral of Benevento, and the area where the remains of Matthew were supposedly discovered prior to the translation remained important to the Lombard princely dynasty. Alfanus, aware of this Lombard historicisation, used his role as architect of the cathedral and ecclesiastical patron of the cult to help the citizens of Salerno to conceive of an acceptable future amid a time of intense socio-political upheaval. In light of Alfanus's interaction with his ethnic identity, visible in his actions and his literary works, I argue this hypothesis should be taken even further. Within the cathedral, that is, in the liturgical space where the collective devotion of the community would have taken place, and indeed still does, the majority of the inscriptions, including the one memorialisation, the deposition of the relics of St Matthew, focus the act of patronage squarely on the Archbishop, using Robert Guiscard merely as a dating mechanism. Furthermore, the style of urban epigraphic inscription Alfanus adopted for his new cathedral was initially popularised in southern Italy by none other than the legendary figure of Archbishop II of Benevento. Incorporating this into the construction of the cathedral was a deliberate decision which physically connected the cathedral to other buildings in Salerno that shared the same Lombard method of publicly articulating power, such as Archbishop's former Palatine chapel, the Church of San Pietro a Corte. Together with Alfanus's focus on the Lombard past within his liturgical hymns written for the celebration of Matthew's feasts, this suggests, rather than merely serving the needs of Guiscard's legitimation project, Alfanus ensured the reinvigorated cult of St Matthew was also a conduit for the continuation of Lombard ethnic identity at Salerno, and that as the cult grew in popularity, it remained in the eyes of the populace an intrinsically Lombard institution, rather than an emblem of the success of the Norman infiltrators. Aside from St Matthew, the only other cult of significance centred at Salerno during the 11th and 12th centuries was that of a group of martyrs named Fortunatus, Caius and Ante. Unfortunately, likely due to the fame of the apostolic cult, the martyrs have received little attention from scholars. A closer look, however, reveals that much like the repackaged cults at Benevento, veneration of the saints was used to connect Salerno's population to their Lombard past and provide the means to actively, though subtly, perform their ethnic identity in the present. The cult appears to have been active within the city throughout the Lombard period, beginning with the translation of the martyrs within the boundary of the city walls at some point during the 830s, and the saints were often worshipped as guardians of the city against Islamic raids. At some point, likely roughly contemporary to the translation, maybe within 3 decades, a passio was also written for the saints, which definitively tied the cult to the Beneventan tradition of the 12 Holy Brothers, as several members of the latter group are explicitly mentioned in the text, including Felix, Donatus, and Januarius. The similarities between the two companion cults do not stop there. Both groups of saints are remembered as North African martyrs, and both groups also contain individuals with the name of Fortunatus. This link with Beneventan sanctity suggests an ethnic significance in the efforts to repopularize the cult alongside that of Matthew at Salerno, given the centrality of Benevento to Lombard religious culture more widely. For the martyrs, unlike Matthew, this popularization program appears to have been the prerogative entirely of the Archbishop, rather than the product of Norman interference. Alfanus I dedicated 2 of his hymns to the saints, both of which display exceptional notions of collectivity between the author and his audience, with references to their shared patria and the labelling of the martyrs as fellow civic saints, leading Arturo Carucci to argue for a sense of Lombard nationalism on display in the hymns. There is also a mysterious reference to the saints' roles as protectors of visible and invisible enemies within one of these hymns, perhaps an allusion to the threat posed by the new Norman political system. Over the following decades, Alfanus' hymns became absorbed into Salernitan liturgy, where their active performance would have provided a platform for the community to recall the Lombard past of the cult and continually reproduce their connection to Lombard, Beneventan saintly tradition. Alongside his literary production, the Archbishop also provided a shrine for the relics of the saints in the crypt of the new cathedral, ensuring Salerno's own typically Lombard cult was not forgotten as the popularity of the apostle grew. This appears to have been a success, as the earliest version of their Passio is passed down to us in an early 12th century manuscript, suggesting continued veneration of the saints into the Norman period. So, together with his actions as ecclesiastical patron of the cult of St Matthew, Alfanus' involvement in the repopularisation of Salerno's martyr saints suggests that despite his alliance with Robert Guiscard, the Archbishop made a concerted effort to nurture ethnic performance among his Lombard population. Within the cult of Matthew, this was done by adopting architectural motifs recognisable as Lombard methods of articulating power, and focusing liturgical celebrations for the feasts of the saint on the Lombard past rather than on the Norman present. This allowed the Salernitan population to engage with the cult as a Lombard cultural institution, headed by their new de facto civic leader, all while pragmatically appeasing the legitimising desires of the Normans. Alongside this, the cult of Fortunatus, Gaius, and Ante was reinvigorated, providing a link between the Lombard past of Salerno, the shared culture of veneration based upon the cults of Benevento, and the present-day reality experienced at Salerno, allowing the ethnic identity of the population to remain central to their relationship with God and their saints. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to any comments or questions you might have.
Thank you very much, William, for your very nice presentation. Very clear and very have a lot of points that I point out, but well, anyway, first of all, I think I'm gonna open the space for some. I don't know if you have some colleagues want to make some questions. I have someone who's texting me here before. I think. Well, he's probably absent. This is the marvelous thing of this camera, no? Because we don't know what all these people here are doing. No, they're here, they're not here. Well, despite of that, again, I want to thank you for your presentation. And I don't know, it's always a thing I keep thinking when I listen. This kind of configuration is a very interesting period of, and it's very hard to not use these words like assimilation or acculturation. Just jump on your mouth, like. But at some point, more or less in the beginning, besides the pointing to Gertz, when you talk about negotiation, and it's just like, of course, it's always some sort of negotiation, no? And it's very hard to identify in which level. And indeed, all this research to reread a very strong historiography, because it's what it's about. We're talking some central understandings about what it was done, who was the winner on this fight, and it also can be applied in different temporalities. But in this case, it's the very moment, and this very strong opinion, especially in Italian historiography, about the presence of Normans. It's like, it's even difficult to bring the subject, in my opinion. It's like people say there's nothing to discuss. It's here. It's done. You can make some parallels maybe with the case of the Franks in the Central Europe. It's more or less the same when you compare. And the previous presentation of Sanctity is not the same, but can bring some interesting parallels. how this how to say border identity is created in order to project it to some, and how it can survive, how it can resist, and most important, how it can always create some say new codes, because of course it's not the same thing that was before, no, because it's to recodify this inheritance in order to survive. And it's very difficult to identify how it survived, because at the end it's some sort of deformation, no? And our identity is not about purity, but it's about deformations, let's say. How you can take all these clues, all this, and the other thing that you point out some moments when you talk about crisis, because the crisis, I guess, is limit, no, this gray zone when the stable institutions don't work anymore, and you need something stronger, some alternative in order to reinforce how to say the whole sense of identity, the whole idea of institution, even in some way. And then you see that the whole thing was just there all the time. It was not like remove it. And because every time we analyze this strong empires, how they managed to conquer everybody, everybody was just happy to follow them, because somehow they realized that they are superior, they're better organized, or they have a superior idea of culture, or they have or just strongly in a military manner, but it's way more than that. And the whole no, but most of this discourses, official discourses that we have in Europe to justify how empires are made or survived or raised somehow, follows this kind of scheme. You know, I struggle a lot of this, especially I'm not European. Then I always see some, like, for me it's a bit strange. How so many smart people can just accept this kind of narrative in order to reinforce, of course, reinforce what? Some sort of projected ideas of nationalism or local nationalism and so on. But again, the dynamic that we see in these moments of how to say, supposedly more homogeneous identity is different for what we see later, because I mean these discourses are still there, but it's not so easy to identify in the same way, I guess, or maybe not. Maybe we're doing something very wrong all this time in order to accept more easily that the things are better mixed. And what you brought was exactly that, some sort of longue durée of this kind of cultural structures. You know? It was not just a thing that was just totally deleted and mixed, and now, okay, we are finally Normans or finally Italians or whatever. And again, and Italy, in my opinion, is very instigating, because we have so many things there in so many layers, no? And well, and that is the whole point. I don't know, when you use well, I don't know how it may be some instrumental use of Gertz that you point out in the beginning. But just to understand it, since you are talking about exactly these projections and so on, well, I'd like to know, I don't know if you can maybe explain better how you try to read this, not like being, like, how to say, serve to some sort of methodology to apply here, that of course doesn't work like that, but What I like with anthropology that you really have this freedom to adapt it and pick things that matter for your research and
Yeah.
discharge others. But generically, we have some resistance, especially from this era of Europe, to use more approach like that than this. So I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, so I came initially from undergrad with an archaeological background. So I've used quite a lot of archaeological sort of conceptions of identity and the kind of fluidity of approaching essentially whatever you've got. Because in archaeology, quite often you'll dig a site and you don't decide what you find. You've got to use whatever you've got. And especially with Clifford Geertz, it's sort of I really want to. It was a mixture. So Pierre Bourdieu's theory of magical action, first of all, was really influential because I quite like the ideas of sort of social action being imbued with significance depending on essentially the society deciding that this action is important for whatever reason, and the kind of disconnectedness from the actual identity itself. And then with Clifford Geertz, I really wanted to sort of dive into these kind of so sanctity into gender and into sort of social status and elite status, which are the three kind of ways that my thesis is set up, and this is a part of one of them. I wanted to dive into those three areas and really think about contextually whether I could pick out sort of performances of a Lombard ethnic identity within those three areas, which might not have previously been ethnic identity, sorry, bearers of ethnic identity before the Norman conquest, but for whatever reason, these things become imbued with this significance within that particular social context. And with sanctity, which is the bit that is I've done the most on so far. That's pretty much well, it's finished as I'd like it to be, although there's always an extra obscure Italian sort of article from the 1960s that I find that I'm like, oh, right, this I need to read that. But it really seems that the notion of the Lombard past wasn't particularly important before the Norman conquest. And then all of a sudden, these three cities, so I'm looking at Capua, Salerno, and Benevento, kind of decided that that was the way that they were going to kind of perform their non-Normanness. I mean, before the 1070s, it's quite hard to even see performances of a Lombard ethnic identity because to be a Lombard was so ingrained in the culture and that they didn't need to perform that. So you only really get these things cropping up. So you get a lot of sudden callbacks to Arachis II, who was kind of the legendary figure of the Lombard past, so to speak. And those don't happen before then. So then I went back to anthropology and I was trying to sort of, get a framework of why is this happening now and kind of dig into the context behind that, and then feed out of it that way. A lot of the historians' work on ethnic identity has also been very useful. Walter Poole, especially, as anyone who's tried to look at historical ethnicity will know, you don't get very far without seeing a footnote to Walter Poole, so you have to kind of go down that route. I try to sort of, because of my archaeological background, I kind of split my methodological reading with anthropology, history, and archaeology, and kind of pulled bits from each of those things to try and get a flexible methodology, but also to one thing I really want to get across in my thesis is that a lot of work on ethnic identities and ethnicities seems to view approaching things with the lens of ethnicity as quite a limiting thing, and quite a factor that you're kind of limiting the scope of your research and you're only going to look for certain aspects of society because you're looking for ethnic identity. But instead of viewing it as something limiting, I want to view it as something which actually offers you an opportunity to kind of really dig into these societies and kind of like go as deeply as you want within them societies, for want of a better word for Clifford Geertz. But yeah, kind of view it not as a limiting kind of framework, but actually something which opens up a lot of avenues to kind of look at these societies and look at this negotiation between two cultures in ways that other people haven't, because they're only looking for references to Lombards calling themselves Lombards in sources. They're only looking for overt references to Norman aggression. They're only looking for these things which on the surface level you go, yes, these are ethnically motivated, but also you want to kind of look deeper into the society and think what other parts of the society could be imbued with the kind of collective identity of this group. So yeah, I hope that's answered your question. It turned into a bit of a rant, but yeah.
No, it's like oh, sorry, Sergi.
So I would like to ask a question surrounding this topic, which I find really interesting, as also as giving this theoretical background to the discussion, which I'm taking notes about it. My question was going back to the last session where I presented this idea of the Spaniards that also appeared to develop this idea, probably much more imposed than really, but also a reaction to this context that really appeared at the context of 9th century. And it also appears in the same time coexisting with the idea of Gothic identity, which also experiments a kind of revival in the same moment. But while the Spaniard identity just rapidly disappears after the context of the conquest, the Gothic identity or the idea that this area was Gothic, it persists quite a lot, and it becomes part of the structural identity of the elites in northeastern Iberia. I would like to know if something, what happens in the case you are studying is just the sudden revival of Lombard identity. It has a longer term. You just haven't studied yet what really happens, which probably in an ongoing research something which can happen. But just I would like to ask you about that.
Are you thinking specifically about the kind of elite identity, or just identity generally across society, or both?
I would like to know about both elements. I mean, I'm primarily working on aristocratic identity in 9th century is much of what you can perceive, but if it's more general, maybe conclusions can be drawn in parallel to those two elements. Question I'm asking for everything, and
Everything.
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So I mean, so in terms of well, first of all, so my research only really goes up to the 1130. There's a lot more to be done, obviously, in the latter sort of half of the Norman rule. But in one thesis, I thought that might not be possible. So you never know. Hopefully, in the future, I might be able to get on that stuff. But in terms of kind of popular identity, it's hard to tell. I mean, well, I'll start with the elite identity first. That might be easier. That the elite sphere is where scholars have mostly looked at the sort of assimilation between Lombards and Normans to argue that Lombard identity wasn't particularly strong. The Normans also didn't have a strong sense of Normanitas, or at least the ones who came to southern Italy didn't have this strong sense of Normanitas, and that by around 1130, it's argued that there's no difference between a Lombard and a Norman. That is the current sort of consensus. I would agree that that exists, but only within elite circles, particularly. I mean, this Norman invasion, as you will, or conquest, was also completely a military conquest of elite men, or people who would then be given land to become elite men. So it wasn't a kind of it wasn't a migration. There weren't large numbers of women or children moved. It was primarily sort of, adult males, warriors, or knights, who came to southern Italy. I would argue that by 1130, there was a new kind of hybrid elite identity which formed, which kind of, because also you had the development of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, this kind of superseded ethnicity. So ethnicity to elites became not particularly important. Most elite families were very intermarried by this point. What became your defining characteristic to your identity would be your status within the political system rather than your ethnicity. However, beneath this very elite level, so beneath this kind of the very top of society, within the kind of minor elites, I am just starting looking at a huge collection of charters from Cavoli Terreni. Haven't fully finished them yet, but the trend which seems to be appearing is that within these, not sub-elite, but within these kind of, not the very top of society, the kind of level just beneath that, who still had land, still kind of noble families, there's actually a conscious kind of manipulation of Lombard law to stop intermarried Norman males from inheriting parts of the kind of the family's wealth. So you get quite a lot of like loopholes where a woman will appoint a local priest as her mundwald, rather than if her father dies and her she's unmarried and then her brother-in-law is a Norman, it should, within Lombard law, move to her brother-in-law. But you actually get people kind of appointing cousins and nephews as mundwalds, or as I say, like local priests, like a third party, and that seems to be an attempt to try and stop intermarried Norman males from inheriting the kind of family status, but also the family's wealth. So there does seem to be more ethnic significance in that group just below the elite level. And then it's very hard to tell with the popular group, because not much would have really changed after the initial conquest period. So these sort of, all of the things I mentioned in the presentation about these kind of liturgical celebrations, most of this was in local liturgy until the 14th, 15th century. So there was still, I mean, although the layers of ethnicity would be kind of superseded as you go on, and Lombard becomes such a distant past that, yes, you might not resonate as a Lombard in the 14th century. However, it was still a lot more ingrained in the memory of the region than the Norman conquest was. I'm sure by the 1400s, nobody would have called themselves a Lombard. However, I would argue that by the end of the 12th century, so by the end of the Norman kingdom, a lot of the citizens would still have thought of themselves as a Lombard, yes. There's also a lot of confusing things with the growth of civic identities in southern Italy at this point, and people becoming Salernitans or Capuans or Beneventans. But I do think that this develops parallel to ethnic identity, and that in certain situations, I mean, all identities are situational, yes. In some situations, you would be a Salernitan. However, at the sub-elite level, I do think within liturgy, within law, you would still have a sense of being a Lombard, and someone who did not have any Norman ancestors would not in any way have thought themselves as Norman, and that would have stayed at the kind of elite groups of society. So yeah, I hope that covers as much as I can for now.
Thank you. I think so. Thank you. It was very comprehensive and also interesting to hear about it. Just this distinction going in two levels, and even that the difficulties of working on ethnic identity when it's not just the only identity related to the broadship or even practice of power, something which I think is very transversal, and it's a further complication for everyone trying to work in that topic in the early Middle Ages. Thank you.
Yeah. Especially in high medieval Italy, the growth of urban identities just makes everything so much more complicated with ethnicity, and yeah, it can be tricky quite a lot of the time.
I think that more or less it's just because there's some reuse or reappropriation, if you can say in this way, starting in 400, 500 Italian, when Lombards, how to say, become a fashion again. And in your opinion, you think somehow it could help to overguide or conditionate some late interpretation? Because especially in Italy, we still have very strong and very erudite analysis from 19th century that are still alive. And surprisingly, it's not even a bad thing, because they're very nice works, but there's all this other side of this continuity when sometimes you can't distinguish, and it brings, of course, this other side of identity, because usually we see identity as something that is exactly horizontal and not when you project it. It's very difficult to distinguish this line of projection or see when it starts to be not very good. I always remember my first impressions. There's this small monography that Paul Junton wrote like years and years ago. It's called Parler du Monage, and he exactly explores these difficulties of being medievalist and the particularity of medievalism, because it's something that's not very far like ancient history and not so close as modern contemporary history. And of course, it's some domain of a lot of interpretations. In the case of Europe, is a domain of when supposedly everything started, the way we are. And the particular case of Lombards, of this very complicated inheritance in Italy, it's like I'm asking myself if you feel that this have some weight on the correct interpretation.
I think definitely, especially because, as you say, in the kind of sort of humanist revival of Lombard, and also the sort of narratives which surrounded the unification of Italy and all of the kind of, well, academic, the narratives that were kind of written around then. Lombards are always equated with Lombardy in, the kind of area around Milan. It's always the northern sort of aspect of the Lombard kingdom of Italy that kind of become repurposed in the 14th, 15th centuries, and also the kind of divides within Italy, the northern attitudes towards the south, kind of take this Lombard heritage away from the south, because it's very much a northern thing which is centered around Milan, and that is not something that wants to be associated with the Lombards of the south, even though you're talking at least 3, 4, if you include the early 13th century, 500 more years of Lombard history and Lombard identity lingering on in the south than there is in the north. However, as you say, since the sort of humanist kind of writings that were done on Italy, Lombardy is the north, and the Lombards were the northern people. So it definitely, a lot of stuff written in the kind of late medieval / early modern, and the stuff written around the kind of 19th century unification era writings never equates the word Lombard with the South, never equates Lombard history with the South, never mentions that aspect of Southern history. So it definitely feels like there's been some kind of erasure of what I'm looking for, which makes it very hard. And then you talk to a lot of people, well, even a lot of things that you read about, which, mentions Lombard identity, it talks about Lombardy and the North, and that does often get in the way. I think the latest reference to Lombard identity within a pre-20th century source in the south is actually about Manfred's reign, written at the time of Manfred. So, this really early 14th century kind of thing. And that is the last time that you hear of anything to do with Lombards in southern Italy. So it definitely gets these kind of, the narratives of Italian history definitely have blurred this aspect of southern Italy's history to some extent, and I do think that's because of Lombardy in the north being, where the Lombards come from now in Italy rather than the south. Yeah, so
They have the ownership of the thing.
yes, exactly, and they have ownership of that identity within the modern era, and yeah, that does definitely
It's
pose
absurd. It
problems.
sounds like that. It's just the kind of a things that you supposedly more you must fight with because it's this conviction is a historiographical conviction. I'm not talking about people in the streets. Like it's so strong that you cannot even bring the topic as a discussion on the table because people are like no, you're crazy, especially
It is.
yeah, you're crazy. No, doesn't exist. And but it's also challenging because it means that we have a lot of work to be done. I mean, you still have
Yes.
jobs, or reason to have it.
Yeah, I would say as well. There's one I went on field work in Campania earlier this year, and Benevento, which unsurprisingly, as I said, was the only city that kind of still presented itself as an actual Lombard city kind of into the 12th century because the Normans didn't actually manage to take it. There does seem to be quite a lot of identity still based around the Lombards in Benevento. I mean, there's a society set up for the kind of research in Lombard history in Benevento. There's a living museum that just someone has set up themselves, and even like sort of signages and like the signage of businesses and stuff does. There's a lot of like Arrakis. There's a lot of references to Lombard, so that does seem to be a small bastion where they haven't actually forgotten that they were also part of this identity, which was quite interesting to see in the modern age, something that I wasn't expecting.
It's interesting. It's like I remember now. Recently, we received he's I guess finished his master with a very interesting research on chronicles from I guess 15th century, exactly from Venice, and then it's exactly that. It's how all this spirit from Lombard inheritance embody all the particularities of the freedom of the republic.
Yeah.
All the great virtues come from that. In opposition
Yeah.
to what in the south. Then, and this still works to shape all this current understandings. But anyway, and just last thing, you are. It's I see that you have other colleagues more or less working with some kind of aligned perspective, maybe. And I didn't have the opportunity to discuss more about Professor Oldfield, but I guess you have some environment where you're discussing this kind of approaches, no? I suppose.
Yeah, we do. I mean, so Lee Brooks is working on identity in Lincoln, generally speaking, in England. He has just finished, actually, so he's now gone. But there is a group, there's also someone who has just finished, but is still around in Manchester who works on royal identities in Anglo-Saxon England. So we do have it's a very informal discussions usually usually with some beer, which is quite nice. But yes, there is a group going on, and as you say, Paul is really into all of this stuff as well, and I think he's now moving on to look at soundscapes and how that interacts with Italian identity in the south. So it's nice to be around that and have some nice conversations. Yeah, it's good.
It's also good because you have I don't know, it's like we always have some advantage or disadvantage depending on the perspective when you are dislodged of this environment.
Yeah.
Here, for example, I live in Catalonia, then I see my colleagues working, and of course for them it's still something too familiar. And for me it's harder because it's another language, it's another usage, and something sounds weird for me, like or some assumptions that sometimes I see. And for me it's not so obvious. I think we can always have a good result of this contact. But anyway, there's some and then just another thing more or less to finish what I was commenting in the beginning. I always ask myself if this huge differences of approach that we have between high Middle Ages and late Middle Ages are really because it's just the difference, or is because we choose to. And sometimes I feel it's more about choice, some historiographical choice, some collective, and then enters here some sort of identity, of course.
Yeah.
This is the right way to do, and this is why we do, despite all the scientific paraphernalia to justify it. And it's a pity because in other chronologies we don't face this kind of questions. We don't want to discuss that, and you simply say that it's not there. That we don't have the same issues anymore. But I kind of disagree because we still have, and what you showed actually was very interesting. This persistence in the cold, because it's exactly that. It's how you survive, how you get this alive for so long. You know, and people even understand this anymore, but it's how it is. And that is the point where anthropology can bring some like fresh understanding of all these structures of feeling and representing self-identity. Well, again, we had a very good time. I want to thank you again. It was very, very, very interesting. I'm very happy. Really, 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 really. I was not expecting having all this result. And I hope we can continue to talk in other circumstances. And also, I would like to ask if you have something written now or in preparation that you could send to me. I'd love to read because it's a very interesting approach, and I especially when we enter in this complicated world of Italy and this time. And you know, we have the next session, the idea of the final discussion. And we didn't resolve that yet, but I'd like to ventilate the possibility to prepare some publication but anyway, let's discuss this later. But I think you have a very good opportunity here to prepare some material. William, Curtis, again, thank you very much for
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
And thank you again for your advisor Paul, that for his kindness, and I hope we can talk more next time.
Yeah, and I look forward to the round table, especially at the end of the year. I think it'll be very good. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, and now I think we have some other questions to finalize. I guess no, we passed the time. Yes, we are almost 1 hour and a half here. Anyway, thank you everybody, and see you our next session, which day I always miss. I just want to refresh here. 10th December. Then we have our next session. Then 10th December with Mats Pfeiffer from Lombard, and then we're gonna continue. And I guess we're gonna still. I hope to find everybody there. Have a nice day.
Bye. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.